Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that I found occasional vague references to that sort of captured my imagination and I felt like really connected me to an interesting archetype is this idea of the person who passionately tells you your lineage and who you come from and what great deeds you've done as a way of hyping you up perhaps before you went into war. One of the English attempts at an equivalent that Elizabeth Gilbert picked in her novel The Signature of All Things was haranguer, and one of the key characters was the son of such a person. I also found reference to it in Scottish history as someone who on the battlefield would remind you of where you come from and what you've accomplished and how you can, go forward and prevail. You could also think of it as like a hype person, the person who's maybe talking up an athlete before they're getting ready to go into some kind of competition. So while I have only the most passing cultural experience with, say, boxing, I have this picture that the coach is going to be there going, okay, here are the things to remember, and here's why you're awesome, and you've got this, and you're gonna do well. And of course, American sports in particular, like football, have these cheerleaders, these, people who jump up and down and cheer the band on. I remember my own playing the clarinet badly in high school, playing We Will Rock You from Queen, a classic kind of, build up the energy. And I'm certainly not encouraging my podcast listeners to, go off to war or even, gather their energy to prevail at a sporting event, or even to kind of just build up energy and move in a way that isn't necessarily elegant or aligned. I watched the White Lotus, which I found absolutely delightful for probably different reasons in some ways than a lot of other people. There were all these really nuanced things that I felt like were just such a searing indictment of some of the absurdities of human beings that were captured and portrayed so well. But in one case, the very drunk character is, self-coaching. You've got this, you could do this, as she proceeds to do something that's a horrible idea that has dire consequences. But that kind of, energy we have when we talk ourselves up. I've got this is going to work. One of the stories my mom tells is she borrowed a car from my grandfather, and he was very particular about his brand new cars, and she was trying to get the stroller in. And she said, well, my husband says sometimes when something isn't fitting, you just need a bigger hammer. And she just slammed the trunk onto the stroller, which immediately, created a dent and an extrusion in the metal, which, was very awkward to take back to my grandfather. So I want to be really clear and specific about what I'm offering with this notion. But that being said, I would love to point you to the strength and power of your ancestral lineage. So one of the things that can be really complicated and is also really interesting about our genetic legacy, our biological legacy, is that it comes from this massive honing and distillation of people who were resilient and resourceful and lucky and had really good genetics that won out over, everyone else's genetics. And this combination of figuring out how to survive and survive well enough to even reproduce as what we've inherited. And side note, I could go on at length about how our biology can make us make bad sexual choices because, these people also had babies and figured out how to keep them alive in really adverse circumstances. So this can also, as a side note, be a cautionary for how potent our chemistry is, because the people who maybe took a step back and were like, we're really having a territorial squabble with the neighboring tribe. We're losing a lot of people. We're in the middle of a drought. Our crops are failing. Probably not the best time to have a baby. Let's hold off a little bit. May not have become our many times great grandfathers and grandmothers. So it's worth sort of noting that kind of sidebar caution when it comes to sexuality and some of the wacky choices we might make. We come by it honestly. We are descended from a number of people who, maybe had babies under very, very adverse circumstances. But for the key focus of this, I just think it would be really powerful to sit for a moment and breathe into the distillation of hundreds of thousands of individuals who survived and lived and reproduced. So one of the things I often see about my clients when they incarnate and they choose to have children, it's in a lot of times a really sweet time to have babies, because you're very, very unlikely to lose a child. That's a very improbable outcome. It certainly happens to some people, but you go back to the 1800s and you could pretty much expect like a 50% child mortality rate, like, either in infancy or giving birth, and then, surviving childhood. And there's certainly plenty of, examples of couples that had like 12 children and none of them lived to adulthood, despite them being a bit more prosperous and well off than perhaps their neighbors. And the maternal mortality rates, if you're a soul that's interested in having babies, it's kind of cool to do so in an environment that has a lowness of maternal mortality rates that our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. And we have, secure access to food for most people most of the time. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep working on world hunger. I'm totally in favor of that. But it's staggering to just realize the percentage of humans that are incarnate on the planet where their next meal is coming from, or whether they'll have enough in the, destiny path of the future to be able to have the basic nourishment they need. It's stunning how much that very top of mind concern for our ancestors really isn't present in modern life. So for all the complexity and the messiness and the ways that, modern technology deregulates our nervous system, and social media creates false intimacy and people who can, behave badly online, and all the stuff, putting our arms around all the price of admission that goes with the modern era. My guides sometimes say tongue in cheek, well, for a lot of us, it comes with a really good dental plan, meaning, again, you go back not that far in history and things were pretty grim for what it looked like to navigate human teeth throughout a human lifetime. And in a time where it's really easy to have our nervous systems deregulated, our sleep interrupted, a lot of just dehumanizing of groups of people, there's so much that is so loud and emotional and genuinely stressful in the modern era. I feel like going into this bedrock of, what it really is from an eagle eye kind of perspective is really darn useful. And just the fact that medical care in the Middle Ages was likely to make things worse rather than better in a whole bunch of cases, because they didn't understand germ theory. So the whole, sanitize your hands before you cut into somebody's body just wasn't a thing. But coming back around, the things that we survived in past lives, and in particular the distillation, I keep using that word because it has a precision that I really love, of our genetic legacy and how powerful that is, I think is something worth breathing into as a source of, I've got this. I have so many ancestors standing behind me that were lucky, that were genetically advantageous for being in the world, that were resourceful, that were wise, that made really good survival-oriented choices. And So if we look at the approximate 50% infant mortality on a normal set of circumstances, not a plague or a famine, but just kind of the normal course of a child's life, we're already like so weeding out so many of the people who didn't get the chance to become grandmothers and grandfathers. And again, just the ways that these people figured out how to have enough food to be able to successfully have a child born, and all of the complexity and the wars and the pandemics and the experiences that they found a destiny path through well enough to survive. And some of that, there was people raised other people's children, but there's still like a functionality of being within a system where if the birth parents couldn't take over, there was still this through line of having enough functionality in the systems as a whole to carry the people who became your ancestors through. And one of the things that I love getting to do is kind of being the hype woman, cheering people on in ways that are deeply authentic. So I'm never going to be the person who, is like, you got this. If I'm like, wow, the set of choices you're making are sort of heading for a cliff, and I think that that's going to cause future you a lot of grief, and I would love to counsel you to, shift over perhaps to a path that is more benevolent for future you. So going forward in this, increasingly toxic relationship, or this not dealing with the money situation, or not filing your taxes year after year after year, there are, these things. And I have a lot of compassion for why we might have a pre-diabetic diagnosis and still be eating in a way that doesn't have a great destiny path for us. There's so much complexity to the business of being human, even under the most benevolent circumstances. Human animal is so adapted to get us to do things that would have been really good for hunter-gatherer people. And our instincts and the tension in our body when we move in a way that's functional as a modern person can be really intense and complicated to navigate. And we sort of have this constant part of ourselves that is, in some ways giving really bad counsel. Like our instincts would tell us to, binge eat the highest caloric density foods possible with the most, we get biological rewards for, eating a tub of ice cream on some level, and avoiding exercise. And they're really good reasons for all these things that we do, being addicted to the really toxic relationships, trying to people please to ensure safety. So I really deeply honor the complexity and the fact that just having, good circumstances at the level of fact in a way that would be so amazing to our ancestors. A lot of, if we look at our individual homes and our ability to order things off of eBay and Amazon and really, just have this safety in our homes and this comfort, and you look at castles and the most elite were living in these things that had a horrible discomfort in terms of temperature in order to have safety. Like there was so much that the most elite 500 years ago would be so envious of, like the lower middle class in terms of their level of comfort and safety. And even so, it's still genuinely complicated to be human. So nothing about this is meant to say, oh, your problems aren't such a big deal, champagne problems, don't take them seriously. It is complex to navigate the modern era. Our brains have to work really hard in ways that they weren't developed, just for the number of social connections in our web and the possibilities and the decision fatigue and capitalism selling us, things using emotional language that might not be really, really super aligned. So all of that, I just deep compassion for complexity, the ways that we sometimes behave that might be looked at as self-sabotage, which I just think is different parts of ourselves not playing nice together and finding an elegant path forward. But beneath all of this, I want to really invite you to just feel into the bones of your life that have a safety and solidity that our ancestors never would have dreamed possible. Again, even the elite, we have all these stories of like, oh, and then the elite got toppled and, the next regime came in. And so, people who are the very, very pinnacle of the structure had to have somebody taste their food every day to make sure that they weren't poisoned. It was a very, very complicated, and that doesn't even count like the bed bugs that, they didn't really necessarily have good ways to deal with. So there is a benevolence to our world, and I think it's really nice to feel into that foundation that resides beneath us, and to really pull in even if your family of origin has gotten kind of wacky, the nuclear family opens some opportunities, but also breaks some things. There's a whole complexity about that. Even if your recent ancestors, your family of origin, you're like, wow, if they were giving license to have a child, they would not have issued one to you. Like I get that. I'm not making light of that. But going back further to your ancestors that have passed on, who had children that succeeded in living and then having their own children, and those own children also went through this process thousands and thousands and thousands of times over, this unbroken line of people who didn't have their genetic legacy clipped off by, accident or misfortune before they could have children of their own. And in most cases, we're even around to bring up those children, because children that have parents and people to care for them, have a much higher survival rate. So not always, but mostly. And just the richness of this that lives in your body as your legacy. This is your birthright, to have the DNA of all of these winners at the game of survival, winners at the game of finding a way through difficult circumstances, of resilience, the staggering good luck. Sometimes, we hear that, you could put an eye out, and we look at all the, pencils that are thrown through the air, and, terrible choices that are made, and how few people in our society actually are wearing an eye patch because, they have had an eye put out by ill-advised horsing around in childhood. And so it's just really powerful to kind of imagine this individual standing behind you going, you are the descendant of, biological winners. You are the descendant of those who survived, who found a way, who lived through all manner of terrible conditions, standing behind you, supporting you. This is your legacy. This is your birthright. You've got this. It may be hard. It may be complicated, but you have so much wisdom and history and ability that is woven into the very fabric of your body to find a way through and forward in this business of being alive. And if we were working one-on-one, I could come up with a lot of other really cool evidence of past life wisdom that you have, and resourcefulness in the way that you uniquely survived hard things because you had the wisdom to go into your room with a book or whatever it might have been. If we looked at the story of your life, we could see all the ways that you survived and succeeded because you're here to listen to this now. And it's really useful to give your brain the essay assignment of showing you how you were lucky, how you were resourceful, how you were discerning, how you were resilient, how you, found a way through, how you moved yourself along in a way that has a lot of success, because our brains tend to focus on the areas that there's a gap or a struggle, like, oh wow, money is really tense. Oh wow, there's this health diagnosis, and everything is right and good with being present with those things. I tend to counsel people, if you do have a legitimate problem in your life, it's really good to put your focused attention on it. So sort of sit down and really work with the emotionality around that, and then the problem solving, but chewing on it in the background while you're washing dishes or driving, and just kind of that loop is not using your brain in the best way, and can just be sort of dumping adrenaline and cortisol. And then it can actually make us avoidant for sitting down when we have the calmness and the focus to really look at, like, oh wow, I actually kind of am driving the train off toward a cliff on, or this particular pathway with this particular set of choices. How do I elegantly, in a way that genuinely works for me, turn that destiny path, turn that train, turn that momentum away from going off a cliff? Because I've gone off cliffs before. I'm sure I'll solve it if I go off a cliff, but it's really expensive and stressful and not very fun if we, take something to the point where we have to deal with it on a crisis or emergency basis. It's a lot more elegant, in my admittedly biased opinion. I have opinions about this. I can't necessarily know if this is true for you, but I really think that there's a lot of merit to finding a way. And, if you are in the midst of, figuring out how to land after going over a cliff, cool beans, we can work with that too. But there's this, this kind of, opportunity, ideally, to move in a more elegant way, and finding the evidence of all the times that you turned the momentum tunnel, you turned the destiny path, you turned the train away from something that was going to make things a lot worse for future you, is a really good thing to kind of write up. You could keep it on the notes app of your phone. You could, write it on a sticky note, but giving your brain the essay assignment of, show me the times I made good choices, because we tend to ruminate on the times that choices that we made didn't go very well. And sometimes it's just circumstances where no amount of good choosing with the information and the circumstances you had at the time could have gone differently. But one of the ways our brains, misrepresents reality to us is often, to ruminate on circumstances and the if only I had not stood up for myself with the abuser, or if only I had run at this moment, or if only I had, it would have had a different outcome. And that's often very illusionary. If the bigger circumstance was, you were trying to survive an alcoholic parent who went to the land of physical violence on a regular basis, or those kind of things. So all of this, I've thrown a lot of, little pieces in, but I just really like to invite you to really tune into that legacy of success and resilience and luck, and finding a way forward, even in the most adverse circumstances, that is your biological birthright. And then recognize that our ancestors support us. So these resilient, lucky, determined, creative, imaginative, passionate, whatever combination, good at nurturing and feeding babies, all the things, that they stand behind us, that we have ancestors and people who've come before who are just giving unconditional support and good wishes to us as we go through our journey. And then also, if you really want to juice this up, find the evidence that you have actualized this legacy. The fact that you're here and able to listen to this is an evidence of you finding a way through every challenge that has been thrown at you that could have threatened your survival. And so this kind of relationship of saying, wow, here's how that legacy shows up in my life. And I just think this is a really good thing to put our attention on for a moment. This doesn't have to be an all the time massive kind of thing, but having the foundation of our experience informed by this rather remarkable and amazing legacy of the biological and survival winners that has come into us, and the gift of how many choices and how much elegance we can move within our own lives is just a really cool thing to connect to. So I wanted to offer this to you. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.